Hi, I'm Josh Baker of I'm Not a Monster, and I am this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Hello, Wendy.
Hello, Kev.
So it was only a week ago that we were both sitting in a theatre in the West End in London, watching a play written by one of MetaPod's most intriguing guests. That would be Danny Robbins of the Battersea Poltergeist.
Yeah, it was great to be over in London for a few days and a lot of fun to go to the theatre. I really wasn't sure how a ghost story would be done on stage, and I didn't realize you could get potato chips in a snack tin at the theatre, which probably tells you how long it's been since I've been to the theatre. Or maybe that's just how you do it over there in the West End.
Yes, it is. But anyway, well, what did you think? Would you recommend 222 A Ghost Story to those who can go and see it in London?
I enjoyed it. Might sound strange for a ghost story, but I liked the musical selections and it's a clever perspective on relationships. And yes, I would recommend seeing it. You enjoyed it too, right? Were you scared?
Oh, obviously, I was utterly terrified, and I'm so glad that you were there to protect me. No, not really. As I said to Danny afterwards in an email on Sunday, I'd read a few reviews that said there was a big twist coming. But thankfully, they didn't actually spoil it in the review. So I spent a lot of time actually trying to work out what that might be. Luckily for everybody, I did fail miserably. It's a great show. And if you're in the UK and fancy a trip to the Big Smoke, then we highly recommend it. And you never know, it may get adapted for other audiences because it is very British in context and humour, I would say. So it might get a run in some other countries.
I guess I didn't notice you clutching your seat or biting your nails, but it's good that it kept you thinking. And yeah, hopefully it reaches some other audiences. So shall we tell our audience about this week's guest?
Yeah, this week we talk with investigative journalist, filmmaker and podcaster Josh Baker. We discuss his work on I'm Not a Monster, which is a podcast that tells the story of an American family that ended up in Syria fighting for ISIS. I'm Not a Monster was jointly produced by the BBC Panorama show and PBS Frontline. There's also a film based on the story called Return from ISIS.
At the core of the story is Samantha Sally of Indiana and the question of whether she knowingly and willingly went to Syria with her young children and husband Samantha Elhassani in 2015 to support the terrorist organization. The story is an extraordinary one of human relationships set against a global geopolitical context, connecting the US and average citizens and vulnerable children to places as far-flung as Morocco, Hong Kong, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq.
Yeah, so Josh talks about his 4-year investigation to chronicle the people affected by Samantha's decisions along the way, including her friends and family back in the US, the Yazidi minority children forced into slavery, and her 10-year-old son, who was utilized by ISIS for propaganda to threaten then-President Donald Trump.
Josh works in areas of the world with civil conflict and significant risks to personal safety, yet integrity of people remain at the center of his attention, care, and storytelling. This is evidenced by the podcast's several awards, including an Ambie Award for Best Documentary Podcast, a Webby Award for Podcast Documentary, and very recently an Edward R. Murrow Award.
That's right. It's worth saying we should note before we start that some of our discussion revolves around violence, coercion, and other topics that might be unsettling for some audiences. Thank you very much for listening. It's a really great interview, actually, but we'll start the tape. Josh Baker, thank you so much for joining us for this week's episode of MetaPod. It's a pleasure to have you here on the show.
No, thank you. It's something that's a nice sort of release in a long, stressful day. So thank you.
Okay. First question, really. I mean, we've both listened to the podcast. We've both thoroughly enjoyed and on occasions been quite disturbed by it. But I think that's part of the storytelling. The skill of the storytelling is to kind of trigger those emotions. But I think, first of all, it'd be interesting to know your own kind of journey as the storyteller of I'm Not a Monster. And did you have any kind of conclusion in mind when you started out? And what was it, if there was one?
I mean, so, how I came to this story is completely unique in terms of how I normally come to stories. So, I mean, just the backstory to it is that I was embedded with Iraqi Special Forces in November 2016, and they were trying to retake the Iraqi city of Mosul from ISIS that had been controlled by ISIS for 2 years, more than 2 years. And during that embed, I ended up getting blown up in an ISIS truck bomb. I was very lucky, unlike a lot of people on the street. I got out, got to hospital, got back to London. But that event sort of went round the industry and a few of my contacts, and somebody I hadn't spoken to for years reached out to me to see if I was okay. And it was one of those things where it sort of spiraled into a conversation. We went for coffee. While we're sat at coffee, he brings up a American family who are trapped in the so-called ISIS capital of Raqqa in Syria. And I'm like, hold on, what? Back up. Tell me some more about this. He takes out a video on his phone and shows me a video of a young American boy called Matthew, who at that time I think was 9 years old, starting to build a suicide bomb. He was basically being filmed building his own suicide bomb. He was forced to do it. Now, obviously, I've just lived through a suicide bomb. I've just luckily walked away, and then I'm seeing a very young, vulnerable boy being forced to do that. And sort of the parallels of what I'd lived through and what I was seeing just gave me this ridiculous drive that was like, I'm going to find this kid and I'm going to find the family. And everyone thought I was a bit mad. And about 10 months later, we did. Now, at that point, it sort of changed gear. And it became about, okay, well, how did this happen? How did the family get here? Because his mother, Sam, was insistent that she was forced and taken against her will by her husband, Matthew's stepfather, a man called Samantha Elhassani, to go to ISIS. So it started a journey of what's the truth, basically? Like, how did this happen?
When did you sense there was a bigger story to tell in this? Was it partway through when you thought, hang on a second, it's some things, I'm getting 2 and 2 together and getting 5 kind of thing?
As soon as I sat down with Matthew's mother, Sam, and she sort of gave this narrative of, I've been tricked. We knew that, at that point it becomes, okay, so like, what is the truth here? Now, I don't think any of us in our wildest imagination thought it would go on for 4 years. Yeah. I mean, throughout the production process, there were ample times when we're like, okay, we're going to broadcast, and we had broadcast dates fixed, and then something would happen, which meant we couldn't, Matthew potentially being in the custody of child services, we weren't going to do anything to put him at risk, would be one example. But to be honest with you, thank God we didn't, because it kind of turned out well that it did go on for 4 years, because it meant that we had this incredibly comprehensive story and also a really happy ending to something that is quite traumatic.
Josh, for the listeners who maybe haven't listened to the podcast, or it's also a film, there's a film version of it. The name comes directly from Samantha, the main subject of the story, and something that she says to you in an interview. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a monster. For those who haven't listened to the podcast yet, what kind of story is this? Is this about human nature? Is it about politics? Is it about war? How do you focus your storytelling?
I mean, I think this story is, what we try to do is keep the premise or the conceit of the story quite simple into like did she know she was going or didn't she? And along the way, we occasionally touch upon context of Sam's environment, or explain something about life within ISIS so that people understand the environment. But I try to actually stay away from the geopolitical and make this a story about people and the decisions that people make and how they come to those decisions. So, for example, once Samantha was inside ISIS territory, she was confronted with making a appalling decision, finding the best worst choice she could, One example of this would be that Sam ended up buying slaves. In 2014, ISIS came to a place called Sinjar in Iraq, and they kidnapped or killed about 10,000 people from a religious minority known as the Yazidis. And these people were openly traded in ISIS territory. So I went to meet one of these slaves, I tracked them down, and I go there thinking Sam is going to be hated. If anyone's got a legitimate reason to hate Sam, it's somebody who was a slave. And actually, of 3 slaves that Sam owned, all of them love her and consider her action of buying them something that saved their life. So just with Samantha, just when you think you've made your up about, pulled a completely different direction. And that's what it was like for me in real life, sort of following the story as it unfolded.
How typical is her story? I mean, of course, there are thousands of women in similar positions, I suppose you could say. How typical or what exactly is unique about it?
I mean, Sam's story is pretty unique in that she didn't choose seemingly to convert to ISIS's extremist brand of Islam, or didn't choose to support. Well, actually, I probably can't say that. She didn't choose to pursue their ideological goals, should we say, but yet ended up at the heart of the so-called Islamic State. But that said, I speak to women who are within ISIS weekly, multiple women, and it's so interesting because I think we think of these people as just so extreme and so unreachable in terms of our ability to interact or talk to them. And, they are people that have supported a group that's committed genocide and some of the worst atrocities we've seen for decades. So that can't be excused. But at the same time, I find myself in some of the most bizarre and intriguing chats where they give me these little nuggets about what it was like to live in ISIS. And then at the same time, they, some of these people left Western society in 2014, 2013. And so they want to understand what gender neutrality is. They want to understand what Bitcoin is. One question I got was, are all gay men fashionable? So, there are these absurd conversations that go on a weekly basis with these people who are potentially a lot more human than we tend to think of them. That doesn't excuse their behavior, though.
One of the things that struck me about Sam and her family is that they're Jehovah's Witnesses, or that's how she grew up. And I think at the beginning, you're speaking to her about why she's accepted a plea bargain. And there's what seems like an extreme fear of a judicial process, a trial, and what that would do to her family. She says, can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, did her upbringing or religious background have anything to do with that, do you think?
I think in that specific circumstance, Sam had reached the point where she felt that actions or decisions she'd made had basically, traumatized her parents, caused great grief to her children. And there was a chance that if she went to trial, that her son, Matthew, would be the witness. So I think at that point, what she was trying to do was potentially less to do with her religious background, but was more to do with avoiding having to put her children in her mind through more. I also think, to be honest with you, there is another side to it, whereby at that point, some of the evidence of some of the crimes she committed, which won't be what people expected, was so damning that going to trial would potentially lead to quite a much larger sentence than she ended up getting.
I think it's episode 7 where you kind of drop, it certainly felt like a bombshell to me, but there's the revelation that she was actually informing for the FBI, which was the kind of the James Bondian plot twist, if we can call it that. I mean, at what point did you discover that? And did that kind of alter the way you were pulling together the narrative and the way you dealt with her and the way you dealt with authorities? Because it's quite a sudden, oh, right, okay, that's a bit odd.
So I actually discovered, I had it suggested to me very early on in my sort of research into Sam's background. Yeah. I couldn't prove it, But I had it suggested to me very early on. So I knew there was this thing. Then when I met Sam in Syria, or I found Sam in Syria after a sort of 10-day sleepless search, I couldn't really talk to her about it because she was in the custody of a Kurdish militia that if they had the concept that she was an FBI spy, her life might get very unpleasant very quickly. It was probably one of the weirdest interviews I've ever done with somebody, because at that point, I had to be very mindful of the questions I asked her, because the ramifications of certain things, because all of these interviews are monitored, could have caused danger to her and her kids. So no matter whether I think, what I think about her personally, I do have a duty of care to her. So it was a very difficult interview to navigate. But in terms of the sort of discovery, it was absurd. And the FBI only confirmed it after we replied them, and they were very aware that we were going to allege this, and then they sort of came out and said, she was. They vehemently deny that she was involved in anything relating to terrorism, which may be true. Also, the way that terrorism investigations are structured in the US is often that other departments get people to look at specific things, and then that feeds into a wider terrorism investigation. So that might be not quite as black and white as they make out. I think it's something that is very hard for me to get to the bottom of exactly what she was doing, because that information is classified.
Right.
I think in 30 years' time we might have more of an. I find it certainly problematic that she spoke to her FBI handlers just days before she left America for a flight that would essentially land her eventually in the heart of ISIS territory.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, for fear of creating a conspiracy theory about someone who doesn't have the right to respond now, I mean, it wouldn't be a huge leap if working within the American intelligence community by being an informant for the FBI, some have considered her to also be a stool for foreign intelligence and almost perhaps a plant into Syria.
I do think it's very problematic, the timing of when she left and when she spoke to them. I don't believe that Sam was spying for the FBI while she was there. I don't think that's in her wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But, I can't go down the conspiracy theory route. Some people would say, well, it's interesting, isn't it? You let these people go and you see which networks they pass through along the way and how they get there, and then you get the networks that are outside these places. Other people would say, like, there are intelligence failings all the time. Or why should we think Sam was going to ISIS? She told us she was going to Morocco for knee surgery. I don't know, Morocco isn't exactly the hotbed of knee surgery, is it? But there we go. I mean, these things can be extreme or they can just be coincidental. But I do think it is suspicious, and I can certainly say we haven't got the full story as to why and what Sam was doing with the FBI.
Yeah, I mean, not every person who defects or goes to live in another country is a Lee Harvey Oswald, are they? So, but I mean, it's interesting. You said you had a duty of care for her and the children. I mean, you were in kind of danger yourself a couple of times. You mentioned right at the beginning the incident that you were involved in pre this, but when you were investigating and on the ground there, you must have been slightly fearful because of what you were doing, possibly?
Yeah, I think it's always sort of, what we do. I mean, I particularly do an absurd level of planning, right down to mapping things. We have procedures for what we'll do if X happens or Y happens. We take with us an inordinate amount of medical equipment, and we have training and things like that. And then I've been working in and out of conflict zones now for the best part of a decade.
Yeah.
So you do all this prep, but you also know if something goes wrong, like, the plan is useless. It's the preparation that's key, because at least then you have the thoughts or the process that while you're in shock, you can try and bring yourself to remember. But I mean, certainly when we went to Raqqa, not long after it had fallen, for example, that place was littered with IEDs, improvised explosive devices. So we were just walking around trying not to step on things. There were sleeper cells still there. It was incredibly dangerous. I remember after I came back from that, when I went through customs at an airport, my boots were scanned for explosive residue and they came up. So we had obviously been in an environment where there were explosives. And also in one location we visited, a IED was triggered, I think, about 3 days after we were there. So we'd just missed something. So they are incredibly dangerous places at times, but we do an awful lot to try and mitigate that. So no, I would just say, as always for me, like, I've never been somebody in these environments that gets lost in the incitement of conflict or risk, or, you know, some people I know love the notion of getting shot at because of the adrenaline rush. I've always found it distinctly horrible. So I kind of hopefully still know how to read the difference between sort of risk and recklessness. It's sort of something I've tried to do.
Sounds very sensible. I mean, what as a journalist to a journalist here, I mean, we always hopefully pride ourselves on not being emotionally involved in the subject that we're writing about, the people that we're interviewing, et cetera, et cetera. There's one moment, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but it's when you first meet Sam and the children. I think it's shortly after the fall of Raqqa. And I think you say in the podcast yourself, this is an emotional moment for you. It's the end of a number of years of investigating, etc. How do you manage that within your kind of professional etiquette, for want of a better word, because it is quite difficult?
It's incredibly difficult, particularly over prolonged investigative periods, because you know, you get connected to people, and you also understand the context of things to a much greater level than you might normally. So, for example, when I interviewed a survivor of sexual violence, I knew the perpetrators, the house that it had happened, the environment she'd been in, and all the people around her. And that was incredibly difficult. On my side of it, it was a very difficult test for me to take. But what you're conscious of is, in that environment, is not adding any more emotion to that situation. You know, the only person who really matters in that situation is her, and she's had the control taken from her. So giving her the license and control to tell her story how she wants is key. What it means for me later on is it can be very traumatizing and very tiring. And to keep that up for 4 years is exhausting. So you have to put in place practices to look after your mental health. The thing is about the type of work I do is, if you don't look after your mental health, you have no longevity. There are friends of mine who are infinitely more talented than I am, who I admire greatly, but they have just destroyed their mental health and they can't really function anymore at the level that their talent should allow them to. So another thing I would say is that I don't just work in conflict zones. I consciously make an effort to make stories in Nottingham as well as, you know, ISIS-controlled territory.
Speaking of other territories, the first time you visit Indiana and Idaho, if I understood correctly, you're asked to handle guns. Can you tell us about that?
I mean, so for me, I think I did a weapons handling test when I was a cadet at like 15. Mm-hmm. So I have done my sort of like proficiency training for certain weapons. When you do hostile environment courses, they do like weapon system familiarization with you and things like that, depending which course you do. And then I do shoot occasionally. I don't particularly like shooting, but I don't shoot at livestock. I just shoot at targets. So for me, it wasn't too much of a concern. And I've always sort of made an effort to not be that bothered by firearms because I am around them so often in conflict zones. And it also benefits me to understand how to hold a firearm competently, to understand where the safety catch is on an AK-47, so that if somebody is walking about and they're pretty incompetent with that weapon and the safety's not on, I can stay away from them, which happens an obscene amount, to be honest with you. So it's, and also, you know, to go back to when I was blown up, one of the decisions that I made when I was in the US after that was, before returning to a conflict zone, I took myself to a gun range in the US because I wanted to be around the smell of gunfire and also the sounds of gunfire, and to be okay with that. And I remember going onto this range and just being so nervous, and I could feel my heart rate was up. I could feel I was shaking a little bit. And I deliberately stayed there until I was calm. And when I left that, I felt like I, in a weird way, had dealt with something, because I'd exposed myself to something again. Because, again, with trauma, to talk about it for a minute, one thing that's quite difficult is a lot of people experience trauma and they have a traumatic event. And then they will go through, if they're keen on their mental health, they'll go through a process to deal with that event. What is problematic for journalists often is that you are probably going to re-traumatize yourself in a similar or same way later on. Again, managing your mental health is kind of key. So just to come back to a question about weapons, is something that I've always made sure that I'm fairly confident around, even if I am seemingly a terrible shot.
As a follow-up to the weapon conversation, if I may, was it part of the storytelling that you included that? Because on the one hand, you've got you and Sam's father and Matthew's father, you're handling weapons with them. And then the other side of that is Matthew in a video locking and loading a weapon while being narrated by his father. Or was that just, I don't want to use the word happy accident, but you know what I mean?
No, it wasn't like a conscious thing that, like, you know, we'll draw the parallels. It was certainly something that Rick wanted me to do before we did our interview together.
Right.
What is interesting about that from a narrative device point is it kind of tells you something about Rick, right? Rick is a lovely man. I really get on with him. I consider him a friend now.
Mm-hmm.
But he was, you know, he was a middle American who likes his guns and wanted me to partake in that. So just by doing that and laughing at the ridiculousness of my inability to hit a bottle from like 15 meters, you know, just gave us a little interaction with him and told us something about him. So as a narrative device, that's what it was about, basically. Let's learn something about Rick without actually having to sort of narrate it, so to speak. And similarly, you know, with Juan, there's a line in the writing when I first meet him on an elk hunt in Idaho, and I say Juan isn't the biggest fan of journalists, which sort of tells you something about his political disposition and his, you know, notion around how he perceives my profession. That said, again, Juan has become actually quite a good friend, and one of the things that was useful about his testimony, he would always tell me what he knew, and if he didn't know something, he would say, I don't know. Now, to a journalist, that is infinitely easier than somebody giving you 19 different stories and changing facts and pretending they know things, which is something that Sam did a lot, which made fact-checking her story at times, you know, a multi-year process. Because with Sam, she doesn't lie outright necessarily. She often lies by omission. So she'll tell you a story of something that happened, but she'll leave out a key detail, and that key detail would change the entire way you see that scene. For better or for worse, I should say. There are times where she left things out that would make her seem better.
What do you think America's perception of ISIS and more broadly the Middle East is?
Well, I think America's perception of ISIS isn't that dissimilar to the majority of the British population's perception of ISIS. I think what is different is we did have bombs go off here at the Manchester Arena. We did have multiple terrorist attacks. Obviously, there were a few ISIS-inspired shootings in the States. But I think the perception that we tend to build around ISIS with people that joined ISIS is one of, it's quite black and white, right? So it is one that these people are extreme. They want to kill us. They want to completely change our way of life. And, you know, they are the evil of evil. Now, that is accurate for the majority of people who ended up with ISIS. But also within that mix, you have children like Matthew, 9 years old, who were taken there by his parents, who to this day, there are thousands of Matthews who are stuck in Syria in a camp who have now become teenagers who didn't choose to go, but were taken there by their parents. You have some women that will have been taken across the border by their husbands without choice. And even within the terrorist organisation itself, and this isn't apologising them in any way, you know, if you joined that organisation, you supported genocide. But there are levels of believer, and I think that was one of the things that was quite interesting about a lot of the research I did into the group, that some of the Westerns that went and joined ended up being more extreme than some of the people who'd been working for Al-Qaeda in Iraq before ISIS. So there are always tiers of people within these organisations and level of commitment, and the situation is a lot more complex and nuanced sometimes than we possibly like to believe, because if we start going down that route, it means that we potentially have to question our society, we potentially have to question our simple narrative that we build around these things. And also I would say as well, we stick to the narrative of pure evil, it's one that impacts us and makes us probably more at risk, because then we don't comprehend how this happened and we don't comprehend the people that went there and why. And that makes it harder to fight it.
Yeah.
Just a question about the fact that you've also made a film on the same story, Return from ISIS, which people can watch on PBS Frontline or BBC Panorama.
I really appreciate you promoting it. Thank you.
What was the thinking behind creating both?
So I'm a producer-director. Well, I was a print journalist, then I was a producer-director before I was a podcast writer. So it started as a film, but the more time I spent on it and the more this story developed, I've always loved audio and radio. And it was just so clear to me that this was an audio story. Like, it was just, we needed that space to be able to go into these cul-de-sacs and dead ends. And I'll give you an example of this. So if you think in a film, we probably have like 60 minutes to get from start to end and explain what happened. In a film, in a podcast series, we might have 5.5, 10 hours, you know. And what that means is, like, if you think about episode 2 of I'm Not a Monster, we spend the majority of that episode sat with Sam's sister Laurie as she talks to a man who claims he's a people smuggler and tries to negotiate getting her family back from ISIS. Now, that actually doesn't go anywhere. What it does is it tells you what it's like to be a person with relatives with a terrorist group, or a person who's got relatives who are kidnapped. And it takes you into Laurie wrestling with, you know, what is going on with her sister. In a film, we just don't have that time. It's just a scene that sadly doesn't help us get further along our journey. So you lose a lot of the context. And also with the podcast, you can show your working. You can show your journalism in a way you can't in a film. So what it was clear to me is that there was a really excellent film to be told here, but there was also a more expansive story to be done as well.
Just a very brief comment on the film. One of the things that really struck me, and Wendy and I were talking about this on Monday, my recollection of any ISIS-related or ISIS-produced video that you saw on BBC News 24 or, you know, on the broadcast media in the West, it was very grainy, and there's someone standing there and there's the ISIS flag and they've got a vest on or a gun or something. And they just looked like really something that I would put together in my back garden with an old camcorder. And then in the film, you show the footage and it's incredibly slickly produced. I just thought that was amazing, that we never got a sense of, dare we call it, the professionalism that they were putting into the propaganda that they were putting out. You never really saw that in the news media here.
I'd have to disagree, because if you think about some of the beheading videos, very early days, unfortunately, like James Foley and others, typically what ISIS would do is they would use digital SLR cameras with depth of field, so the background would blow out. And you would see, we showed wrongly, I think, in hindsight, and we put on the front pages of papers, you know, these people in orange jumpsuits, which was to signify Guantanamo Bay, being led along depth of fieldy, being knelt down and made to give statements that they were forced to say. What I would say as well is you are right, there is a lot of material that was produced that wasn't readily available in the media. One of the amazing departments at the BBC, which is, I'm so glad we have this department, is called BBC Monitoring.
Yeah.
And they literally gather and monitor all material put out by ISIS. So you can go and watch, for want of a better phrase, the complete works of ISIS from 2013 to present day, if you have permission. And I watched everything from 2013 to like 2019. It's completely horrific. Some of that is incredibly well produced. And that was part of the attraction to it. I think as latter days went on, the people who were producing those videos got killed. So the quality went down. And certainly the material we see coming out now, some of it has been of reasonable quality and sort of almost back to their old standard, but it's not the same. But I think you're right. The thing that we saw with Matthew, which was even in the latter days of the city of Raqqa before it fell, it was very thought out. The location was thought out, the actions that he was doing. And, when I talked to him about his feeling about participating in this, they were just like, he just knew that he had to do this to survive.
Yeah.
And they were doing things like depriving him of food. But one of the things that happened with that is that went out around the world, went out in America, because it was so slickly produced, as you say, shocked the world. And everyone thought this little boy, well, not everyone, a lot of people thought that this boy was a potential threat. So it was one of the things that his father was really keen on when I came to interview Matthew, is that a context was placed around, by Matthew, how these videos had come about, so people could understand the story behind the propaganda. And essentially it gave him a right to sort of reclaim his narrative, if you will.
By the end of the podcast story, you do have the sense that Matthew is this hero survivor whose own story really has yet to be told. If Matthew had been a different kind of kid, would this have turned, of course it would have turned out differently, but do you have maybe a sense of maybe other stories you know about with children and how they've managed to survive or not?
Honestly, you're kind of spot on here. Like, Matthew he's extraordinary. And from the first moment I met him, so the first time I meet him is in this military base, Kurdish militia base. And he comes into the room unannounced. And the more time I spend with him, he has this ability to read a room and work out who has the power in a room, what are the sort of dynamics of the interactions of the adults in the room, and sort of adjust his behavior accordingly. And that sort of depth of emotional intelligence in him, I honest to God think kept him alive at times. And he and I speak about this at one point in the podcast, his ability to understand adults with guns and what they were doing, comprehend how he should adjust his behavior, definitely helped him. I have met, sadly, a number of children who were with ISIS. I've never quite met somebody like Matthew. I think one of the other things that Matthew is afforded in present day that a lot aren't is that because he is American, because he has been able to go home, and because he does have a father that loves him very dearly and is trying very hard to give him a second chance, he has been able to rehabilitate and start a new life in a way that a lot of kids haven't. So Aham, who is Matthew's friend, who was one of the Yazidis who was owned by Sam and her family, again, is an incredibly lovely child. I saw him very recently. Very smart, top of his class at school. But in terms of his sort of future opportunities, because he's stuck in Iraq in a half-built house, he's very limited in what future he can have. And if you set that in an even worse environment, say some of these camps in Syria where we're detaining thousands of ISIS families, what that means for the children is they start to not have many opportunities. They start to be surrounded by an ideology that is abhorrent to us, but they don't know anything different. There are kids in these camps that literally have not seen the outside world. And that is a real threat to us. That is a serious danger for our future.
If we can shift gears as we kind of come to our final quarter of the interview, Josh. You might disagree, but my sense is that the news agenda, in its broadest possible terms, has probably shifted quite rapidly on from the ISIS era, if we can call it that, probably due to quite a few other big global issues, not least the last 20 months and a global pandemic. Do you think there will be time for some kind of wider reflection in the future about what happened, the way it was allowed to happen, and some of the stories which you've covered so wonderfully? Or do you think we as a society have perhaps moved on?
No, I think you're touching upon something that I see it happening in a way that perhaps most people won't expect. I think you're right. First of all, the sort of ISIS in the news is we've got such fatigue. And it's not like ISIS has gone away. It's just the way that they exist has changed. And, the notion of the caliphate, so-called caliphate, is gone. I think what we're starting to see happen now is, although we have news drop-off, the drama space is getting a lot more interested in these stories. And that is interesting to me because it gives license to explore what happened here and reflect, as you say, in a way that is possibly hard sometimes journalistically. And it gives you the freedom to truly take people to this environment and put them in there in a way that you can't always do with journalism. So, for example, if I was writing a drama scene about ISIS, I could make up the combination of, say, 5 different stories I know to give the sentiment of what it's like to go to the shop as a woman. Journalism, I can't do that.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we'll see some of the really interesting reflection.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as a continuation then, I mean, it was the Western intervention and the atrocities that caught the headlines. The presence of Matthew in propaganda videos, and more recently, here in the UK, the case of Shamima Begum and people like that who were trying to get back. The stories do come back, but the coverage, again, as podcast notwithstanding, has often been about the Western intervention and ending the caliphate and the military action. And I wonder if you kind of hinted at it there, but there probably are lots of other stories to tell, whether it was what NGOs did, how refugee camps were created and the stories of the human beings that ended up in those and survived. Is there a kind of a wave of this ready to come out, do you think? Or is some of it just so horrific that it's actually not worth telling, if that's the right phrase to use?
Well, I don't think there's going to be a big resurgence in stories around ISIS, and touch wood, hopefully there is no reason for there to be. But I think in the drama space, you can take people, as I said before, much closer than you can sometimes in a journalistic space, but you will lose some of that horrificness. I think what's interesting is doing something like Monster allows you time to explore this in a way that you can't in news or in film, and really take people there. I think the world has started to move on journalistically from ISIS. That said, I am about to do a very big ISIS story, which I said after Monster I would never do another one. And then within a few months completely ate my words. So
yeah, and I suppose it's a final question on this kind of Western interpretation of things. I mean, the media portrayal of Middle East politics generally, and the West's intervention, if we should call it that, in Middle East politics, I sense the only way to bring about the human interest parts of that is through a podcast like Monsters, as you appear to have shortened the title to, which is great. I mean, to rephrase the question, the Monster podcast is perhaps the only way to cover the human interest stories, because the way of our news cycle works, and just what media organisations, BBC included, what they think we want to see on the 10 o'clock news at night. We want to see the latest, the breaking news, rather than going deep on something.
News and print to some degree have a very difficult challenge. So, as I said, I started in print, I worked a bit in news, and then I made it to long form. And that was deliberate because I got a little bit fed up of having to contextualize something in 500 words, or make, if I was lucky, a 15-minute film, more likely like a 7.5-minute package or less, right? And that's fine for top lines of a moment. But for me, context is everything. And as I sort of said earlier around Sam, when you have the full context of the situation, you start to see things a little differently. And if you remove context, it takes on different meaning. And the news is no different. If you don't have all the context of something and you're very top line, then you can misunderstand the environment that you're covering. That said, news is designed to be short, snappy and concise and just draw you in. It's not designed to do long form. On Monster, we were able to take Sam's story and interrogate what she was saying, basically bring people in like Yazidis who had suffered under ISIS and tell the story of the Yazidi community. Or we were able to, in Syria, spend time with Mustafa, who was a journalist who his hometown had been attacked by ISIS. Kobani, very famously covered all over the news. He'd lost family members, his town was destroyed, and he was confronted with a choice, run and become a refugee, pick up a gun and fight, or pick up a pen and start to document. And he chose the latter, which I think is amazing. I think he's an incredible individual. But to basically just have him take me into what it's like to be a Syrian Kurd who suffered under ISIS, and get his perspective is infinitely more interesting than me writing some script. So I think one of the things that I try to do, and we try to do in journalism, is wherever possible, let's give the platform to the people who lived through it or knew it. And I should only exist in a story to be a device to take us from A to B to C, or to let us know how I'm feeling, or let the audience know how we're doing something. I was very reluctant for many months for the bombing to be used in Monster. It took 3.5 months, my producer Joe to persuade me, because everything I do should be in function of the story.
Yeah.
And I'm really proud of us in Monster giving so many people a chance to just explain things in their own words. And what's really nice actually is what I've just been doing these last couple of months is I've gone back to Iraq. I've returned to see the Yazidis and find out how they're doing now, and sort of let them speak for themselves, because we had a lot of questions at the end of the series as to what they're up to. And I've also done something I won't quite inform you about fully, but I essentially go back to where I was blown up. And that turned out to be one of the best days of my life. So we're sort of going back and trying to essentially, rather than deal with all these questions that we've had post-series of me answer stuff in a Q&A way, which we might still do, but is give the mic to the people who lived it, basically.
An annoyingly broad question.
Yeah.
But what does the West still not understand about the ISIS crisis? And, you know, for those listening, we are recording this the day after people were hanging on to US freight aircrafts trying to escape from the Taliban in Kabul. And the coverage of that has been both enlightening, but also extraordinary and very, I think, sometimes through that prism of the way we look at the Middle East sometimes. So what do we still not understand? And I say we in the royal we.
It's a very broad question. So, I mean, I'll try my best to answer it. I think broadly, often policymakers fail to truly understand culture and the way that things work. And to be fair to them, you can kind of only really learn that by immersing yourself in it, coming from it, or spending time on the ground. I often find the way that policymakers, US, UK, interacting even in environments like Erbil in Iraq or Baghdad, they're picked up in an armoured vehicle, under armed guard. They're driven to their compound where they live, and they only leave that compound in an armoured vehicle under armed guard. And that is an incredibly limiting experience of a culture and an environment. And then if you are charged with making decisions that influence policy on those environments, then, you know, your experiences that you have are going to inform those decisions. And I think particularly when we went into Iraq, I mean, that was just a monumental failure on so many levels. Failure of understanding of culture, failure of understanding what Baathism is, failure to understand that Iraq is an incredibly tribalistic country where tribal leaders from north to south have so much influence, and that power isn't necessarily consolidated in one place, and that you have to win over these people. We don't do intervention well. And I think our current news headlines that we're seeing about Kabul after 20 years is pretty terrible. And I think one of the things, obviously it's terrible, I think one of the things that's is infinitely clear about us as well is we are worryingly establishing ourselves as having a habit of abandoning the people that help us, abandoning the locals that essentially come on board, translate for us or fight for us. After we're done. And that is a pretty bad long-term policy choice for us.
And a bad legacy to leave as well.
Oh, completely. You know, we saw it, you know, I'm dealing currently with a lot of not very nice situations in Kabul, you know, slightly more humanitarian capacity. And I'm working with a lot of soldiers, and they're absolutely devastated at the legacy. You know, a lot of them felt very uncomfortable with being there in the first place. But to see what has happened now, is pretty terrible. And, you know, to bring it back to Monster, it wasn't that long ago that Trump made the snap decision to pull US troops from Syria, which completely rejigged the map of northeastern Syria and saw a lot of innocent civilians die. And most of the civilians that died were Kurds, and Kurds were our boots on the ground in the fight against ISIS. So when it no longer benefits us, we abandoned it. So I think fundamentally, to sort of sum up, we struggle at a policy level to truly understand culture and the environments we're going into and how to best manage those. That leads to poor decision making.
Yep.
I actually will tell you a funny anecdote quickly, or something I find funny. I was at Whitehall once at a sort of conference about the future of Iraq. And I was there with a prominent Iraqi academic who's brilliant. While we were there, the Foreign Office's lead, or one of their leads on Iraq, came up to us to chat to us. And I'm not saying age is a thing, but he was a very young man. And his only concept of Iraq, again, was flying into Baghdad, getting in an armoured vehicle and running off to the Green Zone. And he asked my friend, what is it that we should be doing in Iraq to help or to make a difference? And my friend just bluntly turned around and said, leave us alone to make our decisions. And he couldn't comprehend it. He didn't expect that to be the answer. Yeah. I think in some ways, you have to listen to the people who grew up there, and it's their country, not ours.
Yeah. Josh, is there more to come on the I'm Not a Monster story? And if not, what else are you working on in the podcast area?
So we're doing 2 or 3 epilogue episodes to the series. One is very dear to my heart, and I'm just trying to get it right so it doesn't seem like it's too about me. And then as a fallout from going to do these epilogues, I have found myself involved in possibly one of the most famous stories around people that travel to join ISIS. And we are now just starting to do a series 2 to I'm Not a Monster, which will be a different person's story. That will be much more UK focused and will be done in a way around this story that's never been heard before. And it's just the testimony I've been given is quite extraordinary. It's probably the most important interview I've ever done in my career, and I didn't expect to get it, and it fell out off the back of Monster, basically.
Okay, well, we'll be on the watch for those.
I think it'll be
or listen.
End of the year or beginning of next year when that is up and running.
Okay, well, Josh Baker of I'm Not a Monster, thank you for joining us here on MetaPod, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Josh for making time for us during what was actually a very big news week several weeks back as the situation in Afghanistan worsened.
Yes, thank you to Josh. If you haven't listened to I'm Not a Monster, we highly recommend doing so. It's easy to find wherever you listen. And I recommend watching the film after the podcast. As you heard Josh discussing in our interview, the podcast is more extensive in its exploration of the issues in the story.
You can read more about Josh and his work at his website, joshwbaker.com. We'll put a link in the show notes for you as always. And you can trust that MetaPod will keep you updated on new work from Josh later this year and next. A good reason to follow us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook if you're not already. Plus, there's the occasional zany photo of us at the theatre for a ghost play by Danny Robbins, presenter of the Battersea Poltergeist, as we mentioned before.
Yeah, that's right. And if you're interested in our interview with Danny, just head to episode 15 of MetaPod. All right, so coming next to the MetaPod show, we've got podcast pioneer Elsie Escobar. Elsie is co-founder of She Podcasts, an international network of women in podcasting. You might remember from episode 25 that Todd Cochran, our first podcast pioneer guest, recommended that we talk to Elsie. So we went and tracked her down.
That's right. Elsie's claims to fame include producing one of the first female-led yoga podcasts, back when you could browse all of the podcasts on iTunes in 1 or 2 flicks of a finger. Also, she's been inducted into the Academy of Podcasters Hall of Fame.
Elsie is a spirited advocate for independent podcasting and the medium's potential to amplify community voice. So please tune in to meet Elsie next time around. That's it for now.
Yep, and we'll see you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.